This launch of the private sector strategy on climate change will not only mobilize the financial and technical resources needed for climate actions, as well as innovate and develop solutions to alleviate the risks. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our partners, Food and Agriculture Organization, National Treasury and Planning, Ministry of Environment and Forestry, the Green Climate Fund, and all our members for supporting us, enabling us to realize such a momentous milestone. We've come from very far, SCEPSA, so really we're very proud of this. So thank you very much. I hope I didn't rush through the presentation, but I'm also conscious there are very many other presenters. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emily. Yeah, I'm able to follow through. Again, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like now to bring on stage Dr. Samuel Njoroge to bring his remarks on the implementation framework of the private sector strategy on climate change. Welcome, sir.
Good morning. So thank you for giving me the chance to make just a few remarks as highlights on the private sector strategy 2022-2030. I'll try to and to the point. My expectation is that probably you have had a time to look at how the complete document looks like. If I can first create the situation that we are in without belaboring what the other speakers are saying, the situation we are in is dire because on average we are spewing about 62 million tons of man-made global warming pollution into our daily share of atmosphere every 24 hours. What that means is like it is an open sewer that is directed to our environment. And that explains the situations that have been mentioned here. So this energy that is trapped by man-made global warming pollution is now, if we can get an equivalent, to exploding about 600,000 first-generation atomic bombs per day, 365 days per year. I think it will come up. If you can bring it up so that we move together. Exactly. So go to the next. There we are. Thank you, Rebecca. So about 600,000 first-generation atomic bombs per day, 365 days per year. So you want to imagine, if you remember the Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that situation. So of course this is coming from all manner of activities, from oil production, from coal plants, coal mining, land transportation, agriculture, industrial processes, air transport, and many others. So of course we know that the largest source of this global warming pollution is the burning of fossil fuels. And you can see the trend there where we are in 2020. So if you just extrapolate that to 2022, you can see that things are so bad. So the global target that has been set by the Paris Agreement is that nations across the world have agreed to work together to achieve zero greenhouse gas emissions by mid-century. And the objective thereby is to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius. And probably 1.5 pre-industrial levels. We are quickly losing this target. So what does it require? It will require transition of the global economy, and it calls for action by all stakeholders, be it public, that are here, private, civil society, and development sector, by adjusting the business models, developing credible plans and strategies for this transition, and by implementing them. So our Kenya target is known. I will not dwell on that, but largely we are looking at achieving 143 metric tons of carbon equivalent by 2030, contributed by 40% by agriculture, land use about 38%, transport about 18%, industrial processes and waste sector, among many others. Of course, our target is to abate 32% by 2030 relative to that business as usual scenario. So now, this is the background which led now to the development of the strategy. And it has been explained by Madam Waita how our economy is dependent on natural resources, and how, for example, agriculture itself accounts for about 65% of all our exports and provides about 75% of total employment in our country, supporting about 80% of the rural population. So you want to imagine if it is finished by climate change, then it means all of us are in problem. So, of course, the economic costs of climate change are high, very high, equivalent to 5% to 8% of our GDP. And all these can be seen from the threats to our coastal region, the rising of the sea level, the threats to our ecosystem, cost of treating animal and human diseases, and of course increased demand for energy, infrastructure, water, grazing, pasture, etc. So then out of these, the private sector then strategy seeks to address all these issues by looking at what can be done, what can the private sector do. So the rationale is there, that the risks are many. They have been mentioned. Physical risks to regulatory and legal risk, reputational risk. But in the midst of these risks, there are also many opportunities that the private sector can tap into by, for example, developing new products and services, looking at expanding the markets, securing supply chains, and improving financial performance and reputation of businesses. So the strategy is therefore created in a way to be able to be aligned to the national strategies that are laid out by the government of Kenya. That is the NDC, the NAP, the NCAP, you all know all these, the KEPSA business agenda, and the Kenya Climate Smart Agriculture Strategy, among other sectorial strategies on climate change, including energy and transport. So the goal of the strategy, therefore, is to integrate climate change adaptation and mitigation into private sector investments, policies, and programs. It is meant to guide the sector on implementation of climate change solutions and strengthen the private sector engagement in climate change mitigation and adaptation in the country. So what are the principles that guide this strategy? In order to achieve the objectives, then the private sector strategy is guided by a number of principles, which again are aligned with our national priorities and other plans. First one is that it must be responsive. The element of consultation and cooperation, and the MSMEs, these are the micro, medium, and small enterprises, are prioritized in the strategy. And then while doing that, ensuring there is equity, there is fairness, and there is inclusion. All these principles are what are exposed, for example, by our National Climate Change Action Plan 2018 to 2022. So the strategy is anchored on 4 pillars. The first pillar is climate change mitigation and ambition. The second pillar is climate change adaptation and resilience ambition. And the third pillar is climate information and capacity building. Of course, before we got here, we had asked the private sector to tell us what are the issues, as were explained by Madam Waita. And one of the issues that came up is that is very little awareness. Because once again, as the first speaker said, the jargon, the language of climate change tends to be understood by only a few. So when we come here and start talking of NDCs, NCAP, NAP, many people, especially in the private sector, don't understand what that jargon is. So in that case, that pillar is to address climate information and capacity building, create awareness among the private sector players to understand what exactly, in the simplest language possible, what exactly does it mean about climate change. Then pillar 4 is on public-private partnership. And then accompanied with this, there are a number of enabling factors. As I have said, the first one is raising awareness of the private sector. Number 2 is enhancing access to technical resources. This includes expertise to address climate risks, because you will find from the thinking of a private sector person, it is not just about expertise, but it comes with cost. So when you're telling a business to be ready for climate change, then they are looking at what cost will that bring to the business. So the expertise needs to be enhanced. Very important, number 3, and will be the key, one of the key issues to be discussed in COP27, is access to finance. This is climate finance, because we have all these risks. These risks, who will take care of them? Where is the money to deal with that? Then reforming the regulatory framework where possible, and then strengthening governance among the private and public sector. So there are 8 objectives which are mentioned in the passing. The first one is the Kenya private sector improves capacities to adapt to existing, design new, and implement climate change solutions. The second objective is the Kenya private sector creates awareness of climate challenges to value chains and knowledge sharing of adaptation and mitigation solutions for business sustainability and overall sustainable development. Then the objective number 3 is provide green finance products and services for climate change mitigation and adaptation, which can well be provided by the private sector. And number 4, improve technical interpretation of climate change issues, participation, monitoring, policy formulation, and implementation. Then 5, once these 4 are done, then we will head to the long-term or kind of outcomes, which number 1 is enhanced adaptive capacities and resilient systems among the private sector. And 2, accelerate the transition towards a regenerative and circular economy. For example, now when you talk about circular economy, it is a jargon to so many businesses. If you talk to an MSME at the end of Turkana or at the end of Taita Taveta, they will wonder what is circular economy. So some language of making sure that sustainable and resilient value chains, that can withstand the effects of climate change. And number 4 is increased green assets and investment at all levels, from the local to the national. The core approaches that will be used in implementation, first of all, and that's why we are here, is the CBIN Kenya as the entity for private sector coordination of the strategy implementation and for monitoring and reporting progress of this. Then creating awareness and building capacities of the private sector, research and knowledge sharing, developing green financial products and services, policy dialogue for investment-friendly climate change policies and regulations that will support the private sector as a whole in engaging in climate change at all levels and across all sectors. I think that gives you the highlight, and I thank you.
Thank you, Daktari, for that good presentation. I will now receive brief remarks from the members here. We'll start with the Assistant FAO Representative in Kenya, Mr. Hamisi Williams. Shall we receive him on stage with a clap?
Thank you. MC, I don't know whether I deserved a clap before I said anything, because I may negate a lot of what you said. But to the members here, representative of the peers, officers of the government, KEPSA, all protocols observed, good morning. Good morning once again. All right, I wanted to have a conversation with you this morning, so it's not like a speech, kind of. But the conversation, my name, as you've heard, is Hamisi Williams. I'm the Deputy Country Representative for FAO and Head of Programs in Kenya. I wanted to share with you on matters climate change, and then I'll share with you something small about the strategy which we are launching today, that has been spearheaded by KEPSA on behalf of the private sector. And that is something that I will talk about, because I wouldn't want us to get out of here with the impression that there is a strategy for KEPSA. I think KEPSA, FAO came together and the government to do this strategy for the private sector. Now, I've been wondering when I'm seated there, and a few occasions we've met and about this strategy. And then I thought that as individuals, when do we stop being private sector? And then I realized that maybe this strategy is actually a strategy for everybody, because we are only public when we are representing public institutions. Immediately we finish that, we become private individuals with private faculties, can think and can act on matters climate change. And I thought that would be my first sharing with the audience. The second sharing with the audience, I want to pick a quote from Barack Obama of the US. And he said about climate change that we are the first generation to experience firsthand the effects of climate change. And again, we could be the last generation that have some little time left to do something about it. And that also got me thinking a lot. Because if we don't do something about it with the little time left, then what it means is that we have robbed totally the future generation. They will not find a planet to stay in. So our forefathers, even if they did not do something, maybe they brought these problems to us. We have therefore to act differently from what they did. If they did not act, If they did not change, we, I think, have the obligation to do something different from what they did that time. You know, I read somewhere, it is a funny joke about climate change. Somebody said that if you look at the current generation, if trees were emitting Wi-Fi signals, then everyone would have planted 100 every day and ensured that those trees are well taken care of. But finally, trees emit oxygen, which we breathe. But somehow we don't think that that is very important and we should plant them. That tells you sometimes how tilted our approach to climate change is, and to climate change mitigation and adaptation. And that just brings the underlying factor, which I want to talk about as a member of FAO. FAO being the UN agency that is in charge or well charged with matters food and nutrition security, and also dealing with matters climate change. We've been at the forefront of ensuring that the conversation about climate change is actually taken seriously. We've been at the forefront because of a few reasons. One key one is that when you're involved in the matters food and nutrition security, the way we produce food, the way we do agriculture, sometimes is one of the key contributors to climate change. Because you want to cut a tree somewhere to open up land. If we use those methods and we want to stick to them, we don't want to change them, then it means that as we produce our food, we are also contributing to climate change in a big way. And that's why we therefore are calling for new ways of doing things. We're going to change our ways, our approaches, come up with the new ones. We're going to start thinking of how to do more, produce more food with less. Droughts, the floods. If you've been around here, then you know that somehow since 2017, Kenya and the entire Horn of Africa have never rested from the issues of climate change. And maybe you are in Nairobi, but sometimes you don't go out there. I do. And meet people out there, meet farmers out there, meet pastoralists out there. And you'll find them with stories that are very, very tangible, practical. And they'll tell you what they've gone through. 2017 facing a lot of drought. Immediately that ends, you got a lot of floods. Immediately that ends, you got a lot of drought again. Then you got COVID-19. And then we got desert locust here, coming in for the first time after 70 years. So now we're going back to the fasts. For the first time after 70 years, we had a serious invasion of desert locust. And if you went into trenches with the people there, they'll give you the stories. And if you studied why this happened, you don't know any other reason but climate change. And you looked at how that also happened and stayed here, almost making a place like Kenya a recession country that we never were before. Why? Is because the phenomenon is different, changing, and changing fast. And look at what we have today. 5th failed season of cropping or production. Again, there we say another fast has been recorded. The first prolonged drought of this nature we are seeing after 40 years. What does that tell us again? That the change that is attributed to climate change is real, happening, and fast. And now we talk of about 4.5 million people that are facing starvation. We talk about 2.5 heads of livestock that are already dead. And my worry is it's still at the livestock level. With the failed season, fifth season, maybe we are staring at something worse. So these are things that sound the alarm bells to us. And just like somebody who made a joke, it's a matter of life and death, but it's not Wi-Fi. So when can we start taking these matters seriously, get them out of the boardroom, go out there and make sure that we make a change? And I wanted to just make this my call. And that's why I started by saying, I've been wondering a lot who private sector is. So if we can all agree that when we are bound by our institutions, then we become private sector, then we know a few things we can do about climate change without having to get permission from anyone. We simply know that we can start planting trees around. We don't need permission from anyone. We met with Kenya Prisons the other day, and they're telling us under the Greening Kenya program, they have about 2 million seedlings that are lying there waiting to be planted. And I see the big guy from environment is nodding, knowing that that is true. And they are ready to give you for free. We have a conversation with them here on Greening Kenya, and we are saying, how many trees do we need? Millions of them. Why don't we do this? Put them anywhere there is space, next to our doors, at the balcony. That's something that we can just do as individuals. That doesn't require a conference. That doesn't require strategy. That's a private conversation we can have with ourselves and do something to cool this earth. You know, sometimes I thought that maybe we are the problem as human beings. We are disturbing everything else on this planet. The other day I watched a small clip. Somebody crazily decided to say, what would happen to the planet Earth if human beings were out of it? I mean, if we just woke up from tomorrow, and we will not wake up anyway if we are not there. But let's just say that from tomorrow we are not there. What will happen? And the first thing this person started with, and I agree with him, is that a city like Nairobi or New York, with over about 20 million people in New York, within the first 2 hours of no human activity, and it's one of the things disturbing us about climate change is temperatures rising. So meaning we are the cause. Why don't we do activities that are not going to contribute? So the call is true. Let's do something about climate change. But if you can't totally, just decide not to disturb the planet. Don't do anything. You're better off again that way. Because if you do some things, you are really injuring the planet and you are contributing to the climate change. And now, most importantly for me, is where do we go from here? And I talked about, let's use the modern ways. Let's approach climate change with technology. Let's try to build the resilience of our people so that they are able to also survive the vagaries of climate change whenever that arises. Because when people are vulnerable, then they are not even contributing again to reducing the effect of the climate change. Most importantly again, is something that has happened which has led us to the strategy today. Because this was a GCF funded project which FAO and the government have been implementing, and I want to say that for the first time I saw something very interesting and very nice, that this conversation brought on the table private sector. representative, which is KEPSA. And KEPSA has done a very good job there because they led the conversation, and as the project is coming to an end, the natural adaptation project, we are having a strategy. And I think I listened carefully when the tenets of the strategy were being given here. The point which I thought should come out clearly is that as members of the private sector, which we have agreed includes you as an individual, let's use the strategy as a guide to help us participate and do what it takes to be able to control, mitigate, and help on adaptation matters of climate change in this country. That is critical for us. And now that we have the strategy as FAO and at the banner of the UN working together, we're looking into 4 things. 1, we're looking into better production. And that means how do you just make sure that there is food, matters nutrition are observed, but it is done with the idea of matters climate change in mind. There we are advocating a lot now in Kenya for climate smart agriculture. The other area is better nutrition, because it's just not enough to say food is here, but it has to be food that is meaningful, that is also contributing to making people healthy. And then we're looking at better environment, which covers all the aspects of what has been discussed here and what will still be discussed here as we go ahead. And we think that with those 3 well observed, then we will lead to better life. And we'll be able to coexist very well with our environment. These were geared towards making Kenya very ready for mitigation and adaptation aspects of climate change, and that has been supported by the GCF, and I want to laud that partnership very much. From the National Treasury, the NDA, we worked together, also with the Ministry of Environment. Actually, thank you so much from the environment, because that was a very supportive arm to the success of this project and also the success of the strategy we are doing today. And I know from the ministry again, we are now having the conversation on the NCAP, which is going on, and it's really at a very advanced stage. And that is also bringing out what we need to do to be able to mitigate climate. The point finally is to just keep committing that we want to continue in this conversation. We want to continue leading the technical support as FAO, because we have the capacity to do that. But from where you are, just like KEPSA, and we've worked together with them, whichever institution you represent, come to the table. Let's have a dialogue. Let's agree on some mutually beneficial ways of how we can work, act, behave, approach this together, and make sure that we mitigate climate change effect in this country. With those very remarks, I want to thank you so much once again, and it is my hope that the strategy we are launching today will actually be implemented not by KEPSA. KEPSA has spearheaded this, but by each and every one of us as private sector individuals or as private individuals. Let's pick something we can do on this strategy. Thank you, and may God bless you.
Thank you, sir. For sure you did it. You deserve that clap before you made your presentation and now after. Thank you very much. I think in more than one ways, Mr. Hamisi has reminded us of that great quote by the late Professor Wangari Maathai. He said it is the little things that citizens do that make the difference. Planting that single tree somewhere will make a lot of difference. I think we have been seated for some time now, and we still have a few more who are coming up. I suggest we just stand up, turn to the person on your right, on your left, and just stretch a bit. Then we be seated for the next. Not moving out, just greeting. Some breather. I think it is part of the climate change management, at least within this meeting. Thank you. We will be seated. We will be seated, and on the stage next will be the Regional Principal Officer, Green Growth and Climate, AFDB, Dr. Olufunso. I am fearing to mention the second name, lest my tongue refuses to work, but welcome, sir.
Thanks, Harry. Good morning, everyone. I want to stand on existing protocols, and I have to say I'm really pleased to be here today. Thank you to the leadership of KEPSA for inviting the African Development Bank to this conversation. I think it's important to acknowledge the leadership and the role that you play in bringing multiple and a very diverse group together around a very common strategy and goal. And I think you have become a template that we often recommend for other countries within the region. Thank you for the work that you do. And more importantly, we are having a conversation that is very relevant, but more importantly, that is very timely. And I think the situations around us within this country helps us to understand that we are at a crossroad. If you call it a development crossroad in Kenya, because we are experiencing a change that is asking a lot of questions out of us. We're experiencing a change that is different from anything we've ever experienced before. And I want to put that into perspective, because in Kenya we have done many things well. And I think the previous presentations they give you the sense of the fact that we have good policy documents, good policy frameworks, if you may. We have good partnership arrangement on the ground. This is an evidence of that. In fact, we've done well even when it comes to climate mitigation. There are very few countries in the world, globally, where you have more than 90% of the energy mix being renewable and green. And Kenya has done extremely well. But here's a paradox as well. For some of the things that we haven't done well, they are unbelievably challenging. And the question we often ask ourselves is, how do you make sense of the fact that a country that is relatively and impressively green when it comes to energy generation is the same country that is grappling with the impact of climate change when it comes to the impact of drought within the semi-arid regions. And I think for us, it's that part of it that is beginning to ask us some very deep, very serious questions about who we are as a group, but also about what kind of future do we want for ourselves. And I want to put it also to help us understand what is happening. We have left climate change to the jargons that a lot of the scientists talk about or use, and then within the multilateral development institutions like ours, we're very familiar with it. But I'll be honest with you as well. I think in the private sector world, you may not call it climate change. You probably just call it risk. Because if you've ever seen the Global Risk Report, and this is an extensive piece of work that collected data from business leaders, private corporations, and they were asking them, what do you foresee to be the greatest risk affecting your businesses over the next 10 years? And this was done globally, and particularly also in Africa. And it will interest you to know that out of the 10 most reports of them are related to climate change. If it is not the failures of climate actions that a country has set for itself, it's something related to biodiversity loss, or even issues around water crisis. Because when it comes to water and climate change, it's a very tricky relationship. When it rains too much, it leads to flood. When it doesn't rain at all, it leads to drought. And at every point in time, you're always going to experience that issues, and our country, Kenya, is currently grappling with all of them. So it's very important to understand the severity of the challenge, but also to recognize that we have a role to play. And unlike what the previous speaker said about the fact that we must expand our categorization of private sector to include individuals, and that would mean millions of people who have the capacity and the capability to do a lot of things. Now the question is always, is there a role for the private sector when it comes to climate actions? I have two answers to that question. One is a technical answer, and the other is a political answer. And you will think that in the world of today, the technical answer, which is yes, there's a role for private sector, will trump the day. But the political answer is it depends. And you wonder, what does it depend on? It depends on a number of things for the private sector to be part of it, this solution. It depends on the overarching state-society relationship. How is the private sector considered to be an actor within the whole development parameters and development equation of a country? It depends on the incentive structures that are in place to structure good behavior towards a common goal. It depends on the role, the power, the authority, and the allocation of values that we place on the private sector. But it also depends on what we define as private sector. Who is a private sector? And I think it's very important, because for the longest we assume private sector to be an homogeneous entity. Unfortunately, it is not. And despite the multiple interests and the profit push and interest of the private sector, but they are people as well who are constantly impacted by climate change. So I think it's very important for us to be able to emphasize that we are at a stage where, beyond the solutions, the private sector is going to continuously experience the impact of the change. And then we're going to need to build new form of partnership. And one of those partnerships is what we're doing at the African Development Bank, where we have built what we call Africa Financial Alliance on Climate Change. So basically, as a premier financial institution, the bank is bringing together multiple financial institutions across the continent and to find room around how do you mainstream the risk. The risk is not something that should deter investment. The risk is not something that should tell us that we don't have a role to play, but rather the risk is something that begs our idea and our approach to doing things differently. And so within the AFAC, African Financial Alliance on Climate Change, we're encouraging a lot of private institutions, corporate entities, to follow the green pathway. And as a bank, we're putting incentives on the table. So we're doing competitive pricing of our financial products available for green investment. And we're also helping countries to diversify, as well as the private sector in these countries, to diversify the amount and the type of instruments that are available. And I want to make a plea here to say that we need to make a big change in Kenya. The private sector has done well with mitigation. And a lot of companies here, you would hear them talk about net zero commitment, and basically towards achieving emission reduction in their operations. And this is a very good thing. And we must continue to encourage them. But it's important that Kenya right now, within the context of its NDCs, must prioritize adaptation more than anything. We need to do big things within a relatively short period of time. So it's a combination of scale and speed. And how do we do that? Right now, we need, between 2020 to 2030 in Kenya, out of the $62 billion that we need to implement the NDC, $44 billion is for adaptation and only $18 billion for mitigation. But when you track the climate finance flows, all the investment, both public sector and private sector investment on climate actions in Kenya, it's quite unfortunate that 80% is going to mitigation and only 20% to adaptation. So what we need to do over the next 8 years is to just turn that completely upside down, reverse that completely, and make sure that 80% of our investment, both public sector and private sector, must, and I use the word must go to adaptation. And when you hear about the things happening in northern parts of Kenya, that is a failure of our adaptation investment. And the question is, can it be done? Is there a role for private sector to lead solutions in adaptation? The answer is yes. And the answer is yes because not that we lack capital. We just need to understand the instrument that we need to use, the level of partnership that we need to build. How do we blend capital from the government together with MDBs like us in order to be able to address the risks that may be there in adaptation, or even make sure that we're able to crowd in other investors. And those are some of the ideas that we need to put on the table. And I'm very grateful again to be invited here. The banks remain committed to supporting the work that you're doing. And if there are ideas that are coming up and we need additional support from MDBs, I can tell you on behalf of all the MDBs working and actively engaging with the vision in Kenya, we remain ready to partner with you. For some of you who will be at COP27, we do invite you to come together and let's see how we can take this partnership forward. There are a number of private sector actors who are not based in Kenya, who are interested in working in Kenya. And I think it's very important that we can put them in touch with local private agents in order to push this work forward. Thank you very much. And I'm hoping the strategy itself is just not any strategy, but it's a call for implementation and it's a call for us to do things differently. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Moving on very well. We also now are going to receive brief remarks from the CEO, Council of Governors Representative, Brian Muthoni. Brian, are you here? Oh, thank you. This one also looks like he needs
when we are having this conversation about climate solutions and climate change, and we are launching the strategy. Is it worth it for our women to trek long distances to go and get water? Is it worth it for our children to drop out of school due to hunger? Is it worth it for our livestock to die because of the impacts that we are experiencing as a result of what I'd say man-made causes? I think that's an honest conversation we need to have, all of us in this room, so that we can really, this planetary crisis that we're having of climate change, pollution, biodiversity loss, I think it's something we can slowly and gradually mitigate as we enhance our resilience of their development budget that is going to mitigate climate change, as well as also assigning responsibilities to CECs to undertake and coordinate the work of climate in the respective counties, amongst others, and as well as setting up the climate change units. All these have been done, but still it's not enough. And that's why we are here to also call upon the private sector to collaborate, to invest in county government so that we can be able to realize the objectives of a public-private partnership in enhancing climate change adaptation. Recently, we also launched the County Climate Fund curriculum, which I think also provides a good opportunity to be able to train our county and ward climate change planning committees so that they can really undertake their much needed role because they are in the front line of defense And some of them will bear the greatest impacts of climate, because that is at the lowest level of planning, and they determine some priorities that the county governments will undertake. And so I think that's an area of focus which I think we can't be blind about. But I would leave you with some key asks that I think all of us can be able to focus on in this conversation. And one is something we can't leave out about the operationalization of climate change units, and also the county environment committees, who are in the front line and also who are in charge of overall environmental management in the respective counties. And I see the DG NEMA is here, and I think that's a conversation we are going to revisit and carry forward, as well as the ministry. I think there is some gap in terms of climate financing, especially also for the county government's access. But I think there is some work pending that we need to do to strengthen also and build the capacity of county governments to be able to tap into what is existing, so that they can complement the allocation from public sources, that is from their development budget. We can also look at supporting county government to enhance technology transfer for adoption of circular economy. I think we can't have such a conversation leaving out the fact that we have a new law in the country that is encouraging us to transit from linear model to a circular economy model. And I think this is timely when we need to revisit this discussion. The issue of promotion of development of agribusiness and value addition hubs in counties, I think that's another area we need to focus on, as well as support to cottage industries and blended credit facility for cooperatives and farmer organizations in ASAL regions. Also to promote human capacity development in the ASALs, and as well as also look for digital solutions and hubs for marketing, telemedicine, and creative industry. All these things have a link to resilience. And of course, we will not leave out women and youth, who bear the greatest brand of climate. But one day I said that, and I said, why do we, and someone told me, why do we keep leaving the boy child behind in every conversation? But I think it's glaring everywhere. And here is whereby we need to look at developing youth and women-led green enterprises, as well as look into development of county climate innovation hubs, and integrate the role of women and youth at the center of every discussion we are having. We can't leave out rangeland restoration, the issues of watershed protection, and also protection of our forests, because they act as things. As well as we also need to look at the issues around commercialization of our livestock, establishing holding grounds and disease-free zones, so that we can really enhance our resilience and the resilience of our communities in the approach that brings citizens at the center of decision-making. I think if any conversation about climate and determining the priorities of county governments and all citizens of county governments, I think they must be at the center of influencing the decisions that government wants to undertake on their behalf with regard to addressing climate action. I don't want to say much, but I really thank you for listening to me. Asanteni sana and blessings. But now, let's get to work, because every little progress that you are going to make, every little contribution you are going to undertake at your household and at your institution, that is going to build a momentum, and we are going to win this war in the long run. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brian, for those wonderful remarks. Let's receive on stage now Faith Gigi to bring comments on behalf of the Deputy Chief Executive Officer, KEPSA. Seems like he has stepped out. Could we have Mr. Amos Njoroge Gathesha, so that we keep to our time, the Principal Administrative Secretary, National Treasury and Planning, to bring his remarks. Let's appreciate him as he comes.
Thank you very much. My name is Amos Gathesha. I'm representing the Principal Secretary, National Treasury, Dr. Julius Muya, who had been invited to come and do this speech. And I'll read the speech, then I'll make my few remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed. I'm most pleased to join you here today on this important occasion for the launch of the private sector strategy on climate change solutions 2022-2030. I wish to take this opportunity to thank KEPSA for the invitation and for spearheading the organization of this important event. Today's event is a milestone towards accelerating private sector participation in low carbon and climate resilient path. Indeed, it reinforces our recognition that public-private partnerships have catalytic potential of transforming actions. Ladies and gentlemen, climate change is a global challenge that requires coordinated partnerships to mobilize sustainable from the private sector and from the public sector in order to meet the huge financial challenges. Our country, Kenya, is already feeling the burden of the associated climate change effects, despite contributing less than 0.03% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. The National Treasury recognizes that climate change, environmental degradation, and loss of biodiversity has profound effect on its sustainable development goals, including economic growth and poverty eradication. Ladies and gentlemen, responding to the climate change challenge requires collective action, including significant financial resources from both public and private sector. Innovative financial mechanisms like the Green Climate Fund presents an opportunity to Kenya to mobilize additional resources from a variety of sources to address the pressing climate mitigation and adaptation needs. The Green Climate Fund is a financial mechanism of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, set up in 2010 to support the effects of developing countries to respond to the challenge of climate change. When the Paris Agreement was reached in 2015, the GCF was given an important role in serving the agreement and supporting the goal of keeping climate change well below 2 degrees Celsius. The GCF offers great opportunities for developing countries like Kenya to access climate finance and enable the country carry out its development objectives with a climate lens. For example, in order to support the private sector investments in climate change, the GCF established a private sector facility dedicated to fund and mobilize private sector private actors, including institutional investors, project sponsors, and financial institutions. The National Treasury, as the national designated authority for the GCF, presents its compliments to Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations for developing and submitting a GCF readiness project that has supported the strategy that we are launching today. Indeed, Kenya has made great strides in contribution of the GCF. Some of the milestones include accreditation of 3 direct access entities, that is NEMA, Acumen Fund and KCB Bank Kenya Limited. 2, 15 projects and programs approved and funded by GCF, valued at approximately USD 229 million. 3, 5 readiness support projects approved and funded, valued at US dollars 4.5 million, of which US dollars 3 million is the NAP readiness support by FAO. The National Treasury, as the NDA, encourages active participation of the local private sector across in developing bankable GCF proposals. I am glad to note and appreciate KEPSA in a special way for their active participation in the implementation of the component 4 of the NAP Readiness Project that sought to strengthen the capacity, investment, and institutionalize private sector participation in climate change adaptation. The development of the private sector strategy on climate change, Solutions 2022-2030, is indeed a good testament of a strong partnership between the government of Kenya and our development partners, and also the private sector in championing for a low-carbon, climate-resilient development path and access to climate financing. Through this strategy, it is expected that private sector will continue to engage, participate, and invest in climate change. One of the long-term outcomes of this strategy is increased green assets and investments at all levels. Without doubt, transitioning to a low-carbon and climate-resilient economy requires significant mobilization of public and private capital. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, the private sector potentially has an important role to play in providing sustainable investments. The public sector, on the other hand, is key in providing an enabling environment and incentives to catalyze green growth agenda. As we head to COP27, the government of Kenya will continue to call for increased climate finance flows to developing countries. We emphasize that the climate finances should be additional to official development assistance, as climate change places additional burden to countries like Kenya. The National Treasury is ready to support further engagements and discussions towards this end. Thank you very much. That's the end of the speech by the Principal Secretary. But I also want to appreciate the depth of knowledge that I have seen this morning around the tables here, and the appreciation of the problem that we are having in this world. Kenya, of course,